Hello, welcome back to Potluck. We are still at home. My guest is still Mr. Matt Lake. We started talking about the infamous serial killer H.H. Holmes with him last week. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks. Nice to
Um,
meet you.
and we're going to pick up right where we left off because you were talking about the burial of H.H. Holmes and his unusual requests.
Right. At this point, to recap, he had achieved worldwide notoriety for his crimes. He had been convicted. He was going to hang. He made massive confessions, and he was able to sell his confession and get a pot of money. He then executed a series of requests for what would happen after he died, and the burial was one of them. He was going to be he was going to be buried in an unmarked grave in a Catholic cemetery, so it was going to be secure, and it was going to be, it wasn't a potter's field or anything. He wanted to be buried in a big box full of wet cement. And when he was in there, he wanted to be covered over in the wet cement. He asked that it harden, and then that he would be buried 10 feet deep in an unmarked plot. It was in Yaden, in Holy Cross Cemetery, just outside of Philadelphia, which is where he was convicted. Immediately, people were asked the question, well, why? And the story that was bandied around, well, he knows what people can do to dead bodies because he did it himself. Therefore, he's trying to protect himself from being cut up and dissected. Somebody had actually approached his lawyer, Samuel Rotan, and had offered $5,000 to have the body, which they would then mummify and use as a sideshow exhibit. So really, he was that level of famous that people were offering to buy his body after he died, and that was the request. The execution took place. It was in front of an invited audience. So the lawyer that all the lawyers that were involved in the trial, the judge that was in the trial, the policeman, the detective, Frank Geyer, who brought him to justice, he was there. Civil dignitaries, invited guests, 100 and some odd people, and he ascended.
Did he invite any friends and family himself?
I don't believe he was. I don't believe he was. He had that opportunity, but it was a large enough audience of people who weren't actually his friends that were there to witness his execution. It was done with great pomp and ceremony. He was accompanied by his two confessors, and he ascended the scaffold and was given an opportunity to speak to the assembled crowd. Having spent the better part of a year saying he'd never killed anybody, and then after he was convicted, turning around and saying, I killed 27 people, on the scaffold with two confessors by his side, he stood up and said, I did not kill the man that I'm accused of killing, and and I did not commit the crime for which I'm about to be hanged. I was only responsible for two deaths, and that was as a doctor committing. It was as a result of an illegal operation. So that's kind of Victorian euphemism for he was an abortion doctor at some point. And so two young ladies died as a result of his actions. They were the only deaths on his conscience. And thank you very much and good night. Mic drop. Gets absolution from the two priests. Gets bagged, swung, and he was 15 minutes suspended. It's unclear that whether he died immediately or whether he was throttled, it wasn't a neck break apparently. And then he was buried. Almost immediately after this happened, the newspaper said, wait a minute, what's all this about this weird burial? Could be to conceal the fact that he wasn't actually buried. It could just be they just buried this block of concrete. Maybe he didn't die after all. And they went so far in the course of the next several months to sell a few more papers, with Holmes in the title. They said, they postulated that he had actually escaped from the gallows and had moved down to South America, where he was growing coffee. And that was published a number of times. Now we fast forward 120 years.
So there was an exhumation, right?
Yes. His great-great-grandson, who was had secured, he found out his great-great-grandson's name is Jeff Mudgett, and Jeff secured, he found out that he was related to this man, and he investigated the family, what would then be family history, and
now is this all tied into that documentary?
Yes, American Ripper, where he was describing how H.H. Holmes could have also been Jack the Ripper. There was an 8-part TV series on the History Channel, and they had clearly determined that an interesting thing would be to discover whether he had actually escaped the gallows, as these newspaper reports had suggested. And so he, with the pocketbook of the history behind him and their legal department and their resources, approached the Orphans Court in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, which is the jurisdiction under which Holmes was buried, petitioned the court to exhume the body and to examine whether this was in fact a relative of whether it was a relative of this the existing descendants, Jeff Mudgett and his father. So they gave DNA samples, Mudgett and his father, and they petitioned the court to exhume the body and to do a forensic examination of the body. And with a lot of money backing them up from the History Channel, they were granted permission to do that.
This the forensic team from the University of Pennsylvania?
That's right. Yeah, they got together this dream team of people to work on this. You have the forensic team from the archaeology department of the University of Pennsylvania. This is a team that had exhumed like mass graves of Irish labourers that were supposedly died of cholera or some kind of infectious disease, and then to examine whether they had in fact been killed by the railway company that had contracted them because they were trying to unionize. This was a team that had worked on that level of exhumation before, but they had massive amounts of funds because this was going to be the crux of two episodes of a massive TV show. So with more than $500,000 for this exhumation process, they went to the archdiocese. They located the exact physical dimensions of the thing that was buried in the plot where Holmes was supposed to have been buried, and they located a coffin-like structure at about the right depth in exactly the plot where it was supposed to be. Now, in the 1890s, they didn't do surveying, and because there was no plot marker, because it was an unmarked grave, they used these things like you start at this tree, and then so it's like 50 paces from there, and then 30 paces down. So they had this. It was very vague, but they used ground sonar to figure out exactly where the grave was.
Probably fairly easy to find a large block of concrete with sonar.
Exactly right. So they got permission. They had the funds to get down there, and they realized, of course, if you're gonna do like an archaeological dig, you need to, and you're trying to find existing remains in concrete. You need to have like heavy digging equipment to get there fast, and then you need like hammer and chisel level stuff to get through the concrete.
I imagine that would create some very specific problems trying to pull remains out of a block of concrete.
It was not at all an easy process. They did a lot of advanced planning, and of course they wanted to have it filmed. So so it needed to be for the documentary. So they had a very specific set of instructions from the court. There was no carnival atmosphere. There was to be no, sort of like crowds of onlookers, no press photography, no red carpet leading up to the grave. None of this. It was supposed to be the carnival atmosphere was the phrase. No carnival atmosphere. Only the team, any experts they needed, family members, and the documentary crew were allowed to be there. And I, therefore, was, waiting at the gates, waiting for them to go away so I could have a look afterwards. And there are a couple of us interested parties who were like gawking around, but we couldn't.
They're selling T-shirts.
I should have been, but I wasn't. They got to a certain level, and then the news helicopters came over from NBC 10, the local news station, because it was a public record. It was they petitioned the court. They mentioned the name H.H. Holmes, and this producer, I think it was his wife actually, had noticed this. So it was immediately on the radar of the local news people. They sent a helicopter over. And of course, the History Channel wanted exclusive footage because they were footing the bill for this colossal thing. So they covered over the thing. They wound up renting a tent, like a wedding marquee tents, to put over the grave so that no one could fly over and film the thing. And eventually, it was dramatic. They got down there. They found a box with wet cement in it. It was like, huzzah! This looks like we've reached it. But as they went through the wet cement, there was just bits of crown molding and construction rubble in there, and no body. And they thought, well, we're doomed then. So they wound up sending, like snow sticks down, essentially, further down beneath this one coffin, and found that there was another buried beneath it, something coffin shaped buried beneath it. So they kept digging. And then they found a solid block of concrete that they then had to chip away at for days and days and days until they located.
So somebody else had dropped concrete down on top of the same spot?
Yep. It was probably a baffle for, how when they bury the pharaohs, there are blind alleys in these like tombs of the pharaohs and in the pyramids, and then they would sometimes sort of like they would put what looks like a burial chamber, and maybe a servant would be in there or something of that ilk, and then there'd be a wall behind it, and then you'd have to chip through there. I think that Holmes probably had the same kind of mentality as a pharaoh. In his own mind, he was that important that he was going to put down a decoy grave on top of it. And it's he's that level of guy. It's fascinating what he did. They got to the grave, the second grave, subsequently anyway, chipped around, and they built out like a man-shaped thing, and there was a skeleton in there. It wasn't just a skeleton, because there was still moustache hair over the teeth. There was a derby hat, like just like the classic hat that he used to wear.
Nerve because of the concrete?
It was, apparently it was a really foul-smelling stew in there. But you're talking here about a recently deceased body encapsulated in concrete, so it's completely anaerobic. No worm's going to get in there. I mean, it's going to fall apart because of like body bacteria, but everything was anaerobic. So there was this it was wet, it was foul smelling, and there was still bits of flesh there. He was not entirely decomposed, and the clothes that he was wearing were intact. His boots were there. They looked through to see whether there were any maker's marks on the clothes, whether there was anything in the pockets. He was pretty much intact. There is a story quite disgusting, and I don't know how true it is, but it is repeated as fact that the brain was still in the brain case, and when they lifted it out, it fell out. So yeah, it's pretty disgusting stuff.
And they were able to prove that it was in fact him.
The process that they went through, as they described in lectures since then, the team has done a number of public lectures about this since. They went through a lot of forensic examination. The Journal of the American Medical Association had an article shortly after Holmes died with the notes of Dr. Talbot, who'd examined him in hospital. There was a dental cast. There was a dental cast of his teeth in this article. There were physical descriptions and so forth, and so there was a very thorough listing of what he was like. His weight, height, build, proportions. One eye was a bit higher than the other. His face was asymmetric in these very specific ways. So there's a shorthand medical description in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and they compared everything from that to the description. You can't really measure a body for height, but there is a forensic there's a forensic way of doing it. If you get a thigh bone, there's a formula for sort of from a thigh bone, it's so long. When you go through this formula, you can figure out roughly within a certain margin of error how tall the body is. So they did that. The body was a little short.
What about DNA, since we have modern relatives?
They drilled a hole in the back of the skull, which was intact, and took bone fragments from a thick part at the back of the skull, and they sent that to an ancient DNA, ancient is anything above 20 or 30 years, facility attached to the University of London, which is skilled in doing this stuff. And that bone dust fragment is where the most intact DNA is likely to be in a body that's been in an anaerobic stew of bacterial decay for 120 years in wet concrete. So that was off there, and it took a while for the results to come back from that. And then there were cheek swabs, I think, certainly DNA samples from Jeff Mudgett and his father. While they were waiting for those DNA results, they compared the dental pattern to these photographs of dental casts that were in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The teeth looked exactly as they did in the thing. The skeletal height was estimated as being quite short compared to the measured height of the live Holmes. So that was a little suspect, a little ropey. And eventually, when the DNA records came back, it was determined that there were a significant number of markers. DNA it's a mathematical probability thing. Rather, you don't sequence an entire genome and compare it. They looked for certain markers, and they looked for 26 markers in the samples from Jeff Mudgett, his father, so the great-grandson and the great-great-grandson of Holmes, and the bone fragments from Holmes's body. Of the 28 markers, 2 were degraded, which meant that you couldn't get good results from them.
Right.
But the other 26 markers were consistent.
Okay.
So
probably him.
It's statistically very, very likely to be him, particularly when you look at all the other evidences,
right,
such as everything he described about the burial was there. It was a male skeleton. It was buried at about the right time. The records of burial were lined up. Now,
what exactly were they hoping to get out of exhuming like this? Other than some good television.
You see, the jaded and cynical part of me says they were looking for good television. It was like $500,000 worth of sort of research went into this, a little more, I think, than $500,000. That particular part cost. It was a very expensive thing, and they were hoping to get a really good beginning, a good through line, and a great conclusion to the season. Jeff Mudgett, and this is also, Jeff Mudgett wanted to settle whether it was part of the narrative. He continues to evolve his Holmes stories. He did not like the results of the findings.
Did he expect it to be somebody else?
He expected it to be somebody else, and has since then picked holes in the findings of the forensic team. He has a couple of good points, and I don't want to dismiss Jeff and his claims as completely off base. The height, there is a big discrepancy in the height. He was measured at 5'7 3/4" to 5'8" in life, and the forensic extrapolation of the leg bone was 5'2", 5'3". So there was a pretty substantial difference in the extrapolated height of the remains versus the height of the actual Holmes. The dental records are very telling. But the chain of custody of this dental imprint is vague, to say the least. It appears in the Journal of the American Medical Association, but it's not labeled. There is no explanation of where it was taken from. The way in which the dental records were taken, the lower set it looks like it was taken from a cadaver. It was when you have dental records taken, there's like a C-shaped dental imprint on the bottom. This was not a C-shaped thing. It had the same, they used the same casting type as you do for the top palate part. Well, if you try and push one of those into the mouth of a living person, it pushes the tongue down the throat, and people don't take dental imprints like that. But this was, the imprint as shown was taken with a top deck, and that is the kind of thing that you only get on a cadaver. And so Jeff's take was that this was suspicious. It looks like it was taken from a cadaver, and there was emphatically, all the newspaper record says that there was no autopsy, no physical examination above and beyond, sort of checking that he was dead at the time of the burial, and then he was at the time of the execution, and then he was taken straight away. So there was no chain of custody for that dental record. So he casts doubt upon the authenticity of that. Oh, the other thing I did not mention was that, I mentioned that he took a while to die when he was hanged. Took you just 15 minutes or so before they cut him down. They checked his neck and the axis and the orbit. There are two neck bones that had been disconnected in the process of hanging, which is not unusual. The forensic examination of the body that they exhumed, no evidence of neck trauma there. There's this thing called a hangman's fracture that people can get from whiplash in cars. I mean, it's easy to damage that vertebra and survive even. No evidence of that in the cadaver that they exhumed.
Now, being buried in concrete, just off of layman's speculation here, is it possible that any of these discrepancies come from a kind of forced shrinkage or pushing together of body and tissue as the concrete hardens?
It is entirely possible. It is entirely possible. I'm speaking as a layman here. I'm not an expert on any of these things. I approach this journalistically. My whole approach to this is a journalistic approach, and I can do research into. I've done a lot of research into things like DNA evidence and what have you, which is outside my regular sphere of training. But this has fascinated me for 4 years now. So I've done a lot of research along the way.
We have already come close to running out of time a second time. So a couple of little things we wanted to cover here right at the end. First, tell us a little bit about your books. And there was a offer you wanted to offer for the viewers today.
Yes, indeed. This book here, Self-Portrait of a Serial Killer is written by Holmes. It's all writings of Holmes, his confessions, his memoirs, interviews that he did with journalists. And I collected all of this stuff as I was researching the thing, and I put it out as a book. I got one of the actors from Murder Castle, the rock opera about Holmes that I told you about, that was done by the Baltimore Rock Opera Society.
Yeah.
And he made an audio book. He read this, all the confessions out. And that book, the audio book, I have download codes for that I'd like to give out. And I think the way in which I'll do it, we'll put my address down, my email address down here. And the first 27 people will get a download code that they can download the audio book, and they can listen. They can have H.H. Holmes whispering his confessions in their ear through the voice of Rex Anderson, the voice actor. But this is something I'd like to offer to people.
Excellent.
Yeah, but you'll get stuck down a rabbit hole. I did, but it's a fascinating story.
And there was one other thing that you wanted to offer?
Yes, actually, in addition to that, if 27 people claim the audiobook and anybody over the top of that, if they, for the next 27 people, I will give a wine label, a set of wine labels. You're familiar? I hope I'm allowed to advertise here. The 19 Crimes wine. I made a label that was a parody of that with 27 crimes with pictures of H.H. Holmes on. The next 27 people, I will get email from them, and I will send. I'll get a physical address, and I will mail them these wine labels so you can put them over your wine bottles.
Excellent. Thank you for coming, Matt. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are over time, so I am K. Patrick Glover. You have been watching Potluck. We will be back soon. You can catch previous episodes of Potluck at www.potluck-online.org. And as always, be safe. Thank you for watching.